Welcome, everybody, to a new session of Cooperation Tulsa Organizer Education. I believe this is session 14, and we are continuing our reading of Full Spectrum Resistance by Eric McBay. So if this is your first time tuning in, don't forget that all of the previous sessions of the reading group are on both the Anark and the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube. If you'd like to become part of the Organizer Education Reading Group, all you have to do is go over to Cooperation Tulsa's Open Collective and become a donor for any amount. Then send us a message and tell us that you became a donor, and we will give you a link to our Discord server. And that way you can actually also attend Popular Education. But I think that is most of the prep that we want to do here. Give me just a moment while I get this last little part set up, and I'm going to share this link around just a little bit. Here we go. Sorry, stumbling through this a little bit. I apologize for anybody listening. Okay, there we go. All right. I will get us started. So we're continuing here after one of those gray boxes. It says, people who are underground or people who are preparing to work underground take precautions to keep a low profile in the age of data mining. Most of those have to do with digital trails and public speech. While in general, it is good and necessary for people to speak out in favor of militant resistance, people who are keeping a low profile usually don't do this outside small face-to-face groups. They're more circumspect in emails, text messages, social networking sites, internet forums, and the like. If they do advocate militant resistance online, they usually use alternate names, hide their IPs with special software like Tor or credible VPNs, and otherwise keep their own identity private. Social networking sites like Facebook are often avoided by those wanting to engage in clandestine resistance because their use creates police-accessible maps of resistant social networks. Even people who are happy to work above ground should exercise care with their personal information online. The alt-right and other online hate groups have been able to use Twitter and other platforms to harass and attack feminists and other activists online. If you use social media, be aware of your privacy settings and keep sensitive information offline to reduce the impact of doxing, the adversarial release of personal information. To keep a low profile, be careful wherever your actions are being tracked in a database. Buy things using cash, especially if buying resistance books or magazines. Maybe don't check out every book you read on your own library card. If you go to a radical conference, you can always use an alias to sign up. Try to avoid leaving a pattern behind that would stick out for data mining software. That said, data mining can also be very misleading to those in power. With millions of people under surveillance, the number of false positives will far outnumber actual underground resistors, as in the case of Josh Cannoli, described later in this chapter. Next heading says, careful communication. Because surveillance is used universally against resistance movements, members must be careful in communications. For above-ground groups, this may be as simple as assuming that the police are privy to any electronic communications or large meetings and choosing their words accordingly. Above-ground groups need mass communication, but they can still conceal information when needed for a surprise action or phrase militant ideas in a way that makes legal prosecution more difficult. Underground groups are extremely careful about communication. They use codes or encryption while keeping unnecessary communication to a minimum. At this point, however, Everyone should try to use encrypted email and messaging whenever possible. It's become much easier to do this with text messages and even voice calls thanks to apps like Signal. Next.
Is that Zan or is that me? Sorry. Are we just at the top of that gray box?
Yeah, the paragraph right above the gray box.
Okay. And again, not everyone needs to keep a low profile. It's important that some people, many people, exclamation point, speak openly and publicly in support of resistance of all kinds. And we've come across another gray box here. Online security resources in bold at the top. Online security recommendations change fast and can become obsolete in months. Rather than relying on something in print, here are some websites you can refer to for up-to-date security resources and best practices. First one we have is the Surveillance Self-Defense. Tips, tools, and how-tos for safer online communications from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Includes primers, tool guides, and security scenarios. And that is ssd.eff.org/English, EN. Next one is Security Resources and Guides on Digital Security from riseup.net, Autonomous Tech Collective. See riseup.net/en/security/resources and also riseup.net/en/security. Then we have the next one being Security in a Box, Digital Security Tools and Tactics from Tactical Technology Collective and Frontline Defenders. Includes some specific regional guides. The website is securityinabox.org/en. Then the next one is going to be Security Planner by the Citizen Lab. That website is securityplanner.org. Then the next one would be Digital First Aid Kit from the Digital Defenders Partnership. Resources with an emphasis on responding to digital security emergencies or attacks. The website for this is digitaldefenders.org/digital first aid. Now we have the next bolded out section here outside of the gray box with the word screening. To maintain security and safety, organized resistance groups of all kinds screen members for behaviors that could be destructive to the group. This could mean anything from nasty attitudes to openly abusive behavior. Underground groups in particular must use rigorous screening of members to exclude police infiltrators or people who are simply unreliable. That rigorous screening process is discussed in an appendix. Infiltrators try to gather information and also to cause discord and disruption within the groups. compartmentalization, the next bolded out section here. Underground organizations don't just have external firewalls. Once they become larger than a handful of people, they also require internal firewalls. These internal firewalls divide the organization into compartments or cells. In an above ground organization, everyone can know everyone else. This is a strength because it provides social support and community while allowing people to easily access the skills and information they need from their comrades. Figure 6.1 Part A. Mobilization is easy in an above ground group, so is infiltration. Of course, in an above ground organization, no one should be doing anything that is highly illegal because it is difficult to keep secret, such as from informers. Part B. Security culture can limit the spread of rumors and sensitive information, Part C, but it's not perfect. Really serious and dangerous action usually shouldn't be taken on by above ground groups unless those activists are willing to risk jail time for themselves and repression for the group. An underground group working without firewalls would be doomed, figure 6.2 Part A. So underground groups protect themselves from infiltration through screening and compartmentalization, Part B. Generally, the people in a given cell only know the other people in that cell. Can you scroll up a little bit?
Sorry, I'm having weird problems with my computer.
That's okay. They don't know everyone. Okay, is that where it was? Yes. They don't know everyone in the entire organization. So even if an infiltrator did sneak into a cell, they would only be able to compromise that one cell, Part C. Those in power can bring massive coercion down on captured resistors. They use legal threats, reprisals against family and friends, torture, imprisonment, and death. It is compartmentalization that keeps whole underground networks from toppling like dominoes if a single person is compromised, which was exactly what happened to the largest underground group involved in the Green Scare, discussed shortly. Resistance movements usually put limits on the number of people any one member can know or identify. For the underground African National Congress, that number was 10. For groups operating under even more repressive surveillance states, this number has been as low as 2 or 3. Next. I'll leave somebody else to
Good
describe
timing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So picture A just shows a network web of people, and it connects one person to at least 2 others, if not up to 5 or 6. Then that is for A. For B, a rumor starts, and it starts at one person, and it goes to 1 or 2 other people, and then it shows a person at the end is with an eyeball, and it says, and gossip reaches informer. It has an X on it. You can scroll. And then C is the rumor starts, and but people trained in security culture stop the spread. So it goes to a couple people, but the trained people make it so it doesn't go from person to person to person. And so that's figure 6-1, above ground organization. This is a new A, and it shows it starts at the informer. Without compartments, informer can compromise entire network. So it's kind of shows that the informer starts something and then it spreads throughout the whole organization and all the network. And then a B is compartmentalized network. It's where it's small groups of people with 3 to 6 people, and it has internal firewalls. So not everybody's connected to everybody. There's some lines where it's only one person connected to one person in other groups. So, and they're like, it looks like the head people because there's nobody else connected to each other except for one person per group. Okay, and the picture C shows informer can only compromise one cell at a time. So if you have an informer, it'll just be in one group because they're not, part of all the groups. And so it gets tracked. Like there's no more that they can do wrong per the little cells. Next. Okay. 6-2, underground organization. Underground groups are extremely careful about how they communicate between compartmentalized cells and also how they communicate with above ground groups. Techniques used include encrypted communications, careful face-to-face meetings, cutouts, and dead drops. Parentheses, more on those in communications and outreach. Just creating compartments is not enough. Resistance movements actively respond to infiltration or security compromises. For example, many movements have had rules that a member was expected to resist torture for 24 to 48 hours to allow the other members of their cell to flee, gain new identities, or go deeper underground. Next subsection, operational security. Resistance groups also use particular security techniques while carrying out actions. Above ground groups may increase their security at a disruptive march with highly visible legal observers and videographers to discourage police violence. Or they might keep the exact route of the march a secret until the last possible moment, or use a radio scanner to monitor police communications and adjust their plans accordingly. Underground groups prepare for an action, might wipe fingerprints from their equipment or post lookouts and ready escape plans. Operational security has a picture of binoculars. So the next subsection is active counterintelligence, which has a picture of an eyeball with a line through it, like we don't do. Many of the security tools described above are passive. Security culture and keeping a low profile consists largely of things you don't do. Firewalls and compartmentalization are largely structural, but resistance movements need more. Persistence attacks from an aggressive and well-funded intelligence apparatus, parentheses, both state and cooperative, in parentheses, require a counterintelligence response that is conscious, active, and self-aware. We need conscious movement defense, and that requires studying history and current events and understanding the many ways that movements are suppressed and destroyed so that we can recognize patterns and make specific appropriate responses. Parentheses. I'll come back to this area in much more detail in Chapter 9, Counterintelligence and Repression. Safety in numbers is the next subsection, and it has a circle with a bunch of different people, a couple different colors in there, just black and gray. Resistant movements that focus on security to the exclusion of outreach and recruitment can be easily isolated and picked off. Ultimate security depends on growing strong and diverse movements that include many different people, making them difficult to continue or repress. Next subsection is safety and care, which is a circle with a cross inside. If misapplied, security consciousness can be a terribly damaging. Rampant paranoia and persecution can destroy whole organizations. And some resistance groups face as much danger from harmful people within the movement as from the external repression. Effective movements do whatever they can to ensure the safety of their members and to take care of one another. In fact, for most movements, this is the single most important tool to emphasize. Taking care of our comrades is one of the most important things we can do. Few people will stick around in any movement if their comrades are hostile, abusive, or generally uncaring. I wish this was obvious, but it's not. It's sometimes the case that completely apolitical people act with more care than militants. Whether our movements feel caring and welcoming will determine whether we can recruit people, whether we can build enduring.
Sorry.
You're fine. Organizations, whether we can undertake serious actions, and whether we can rebound from repression and other challenges. To act with care and love for our comrades and our potential comrades is absolutely a revolutionary imperative. That also means working to challenge and correct even casual forms of sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression in our groups and in our communities. These security tools make a lot more sense in a real life context. Let's look at specific examples like the African National Congress, the Black Panther Party, and the Weather Underground, as well as more recent examples like the Green Scare. These studies starkly illustrate the benefits and pitfalls of different approaches to security. Next.
Zan, do you want to go because you weren't there for your turn?
Sure, I can wait after you. So I'm like number 2.
Okay. So here's a gray box. It says security culture myths. Despite growing awareness about the importance of security culture, there are some misleading myths that still persist. Cops have to identify themselves. Cops can't lie to you, in quotes. Since at least the 1960s, many have believed that police in a group are required to identify themselves if asked. This is an old and persistent myth, but it's wrong. Undercover infiltrators could not do their job if they had to identify themselves. Moreover, cops routinely lie to people to encourage compliance on the street, and especially in interrogation. They are allowed, even instructed, to do this. In quotes, security is about identifying the infiltrator. A few times, I've given talks to a group about security culture and how it works, only to find out that members of the group later engaged in furtive speculation about who in their group might be an infiltrator. It's not a good idea to speculate about who's an infiltrator or to accuse people without having hard evidence. Security culture works by controlling the spread of information rather than picking out police infiltrators. Paranoia can be a deeply destructive behavior for any group. And false accusations are dangerous and sometimes get people killed. There's a name for these accusations: bad jacketing or snitch jacketing. The actual underground infiltrators may very well be the people who accuse others of being infiltrators, as a way of drawing attention away from themselves and inducing divisions and paranoia. It's usually best to deal with bad behavior by addressing that behavior directly, rather than by making accusations. That said, when a real infiltrator is legitimately suspected, there are specific things you can do to respond, which I'll return to in Chapter 9, Counterintelligence and Repression. In quotes, security culture guarantees my safety. There's an element of truth to this myth. Security culture makes us safer, but effective action, any threat to the entitlement of those in power, can lead to repression, either within the legal system or extra-legally. And besides, there can be no guarantee of safety in a world where the biosphere itself is being rapidly and systematically obliterated. For me, the goal of resistance is not to be as personally safe as possible, it's to be as effective as possible. Security culture is a very important tool to that end. That said, everyone has to take on the level of risk that's appropriate to them personally. Above ground and underground divides exist to help protect people, and there are many different organizations with many different risk levels to choose from. In quotes, hiding my identity above ground makes me safe. Many times while organizing different radical workshops, I've seen emails saying, quote, your workshop sounds great, but I don't know if I can sign up because I don't want to be on a list somewhere, end quote. If you don't want to go on a list of radical activists, don't email about it from your personal address. Mostly, I think this is a reflection of self-aggrandizing or paranoia, and that people who email this are looking for some reassurance. In general, keeping low profile is totally valid. It's fine to want to pay cash for things or go to a conference without using your real name, but any action involves risk. Any effective action will draw down reprisals. The state uses conspicuous surveillance to try to make people paranoid and hamper outreach, but above ground movements protect themselves through numbers and solidarity. Safety comes through strong movement connections, not through isolation. Next.
The African National Congress. Everyone has heard of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, but most people know only of the final few years of struggle against apartheid in South Africa, a time when Mandela was in prison and there was enormous international pressure on the South African government. The African National Congress has a much longer history during which it used every tactic on the spectrum and transformed itself from an above ground organization to a clandestine movement to a governing political party. In the process, it inspired countless allied groups and mobilized a movement that spanned the entire planet. The South African Native National Alliance was founded in 1912 to improve the rights of Black South Africans. In 1923, it became the African National Congress, ANC. In its first few decades, fearful of repression, the ANC took a cautious approach. Its tactics emphasized appeals to power, in particular to Britain, rather than strikes or protests. These appeals were largely ignored. The ANC escalated with the Defiance Campaign of the 1950s, coordinating sustained resistance and non cooperation against the unjust laws of apartheid. Although the Defiance Campaign did not result in specific legislative reform, it was good for the ANC. Membership swelled from around 7,000 to around 100,000 in a matter of months. But increased resistance also led to an increase in violent state reprisal. One of those involved with the ANC at the time was a young Nelson Mandela. Already a prominent ANC activist in the 1950s, Mandela had a commitment to nonviolent mass struggle that was shared by many in the ANC. But things were about to change. During the 1950s, the South African state waged a war of both violent and judicial repression. The state arrested and tried 156 resistance leaders, including Mandela, and nearly the entire executive of the ANC, in a 5-year-long treason trial. State violence against the ANC reached a new extreme with the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, in which hundreds of unarmed and peaceful Black protesters were shot by police. After the massacre, Mandela and many others changed their minds about the tactics needed to defeat apartheid. They concluded that nonviolent struggle, as used in India, would not work against the South African government. But faced with growing government persecution and violence, some in the ANC realized that their organizational structure was unsuited for new tactics. And they were fearful that the ANC itself could be declared illegal, as it was later that same year. So Nelson Mandela was tasked with developing a means of organization that would allow the ANC to remain effective even under extreme levels of repression. The plan he devised was both ingenious and audacious. The M Plan, as it became known, was a way of converting a movement of thousands of people into an underground network. In his book, Apartheid's Rebels, Stephen M. Davis writes that, quote, the M Plan's intention was to wean the ANC away from dependence on characteristics of organization most vulnerable to governmental pressure. Mandela envisioned the construction of a cellular network at the grassroots level in constant communication through a hierarchy of middle-level leaders with the national executive, end quote. It was a thoroughly compartmentalized network designed for both high security and maximum communications. To keep cells at an appropriate size, each person should know at most 10 other members. This number was chosen in part because assemblies of more than 10 people were banned by the state. Next.
Government analysts described the new arrangement as a national underground organization, pyramidal in shape and built of cellular units. Each cell is unaware of its brother cells on a horizontal level and is linked vertically to a single member of the cell above, from which orders are received. Security is thus ensured. Mandela later wrote that the idea was to set up organizational machinery that would allow the ANC to take decisions at the highest level, which could then be swiftly transmitted to the organization as a whole without calling a meeting. But the transmission of information was not one way. The intent was not just to ensure security, but to bring the national executive into close contact with the grassroots. Professor Raymond Suttner, who worked underground with the ANC and after apartheid became South African ambassador to Sweden, described it like this, quote, "The plan was not a classic conception for a tightly knit vanguard type underground. Despite the tighter security involved, the M plan also envisioned something, expansion of membership and organization. It was a way of enabling a mass organization to operate in underground conditions. The M plan was organized geographically on a street-by-street basis and was intended primarily for urban areas, since the South African government had forced Black people to relocate into dense settlements. Each cell had a cell steward who would report to a street steward, who would report to a chief steward, who would report to the secretariat of the local ANC branch. Mandela writes, "My notion was that every cell and street steward should know every person and family in his area so that he would be trusted by the people and would know whom to trust. The cell steward arranged meetings, organized political classes, and collected dues. He was the linchpin of the plan. The stewards were ANC cadres. Members and recruits of the underground organization were given political education classes as part of their training." Mandela explains, "As part of the M plan, the ANC introduced an elementary course of political lectures for its members throughout the country. These lectures were meant not only to educate, but to hold the organization together. They were given in secret by branch leaders. Those members in attendance would in turn give the same lectures to others in their homes and communities. In the beginning, the lectures were not systemized, but within a number of months, there was a set curriculum. There were 3 courses, quote, the world we live in, next one, how we are governed, and the need for change. In the first course, we discussed the different types of political and economic systems around the world, as well as in South Africa. It was an overview of the growth of capitalism as well as socialism. We discussed, for example, how Blacks in South Africa were oppressed both as a race and an economic class. The lecturers were mostly band members, and I myself frequently gave lectures in the evening. This arrangement had the virtue of keeping band individuals active, as well as keeping the membership in touch with these leaders." Next.
The ANC survived underground both because of the M plan and its inclusive system of core beliefs. Quote, ideological, the Congress was also better equipped than rival groups to survive in the shadows, end quote, explains Davis. The ANC, he notes, quote, with its broad endorsement of democracy, could appeal not just to Blacks, but to many brackets, multiracial people, in bracket, Indians, and even friendly elements of the white community. As a result, the ANC earned the considerable benefit of cooperation with a variety of constituencies, end quote. Its decades-long history of struggle was essential and stabilized the movement. As Davis notes, quote, by the time it was banned in 1960, in fact, the ANC had taken on a look that would remain largely consistent for the coming decades. In addition, it could claim to have tried a multitude of peaceful and legal means to overturn the expanding machinery of apartheid and failed in each effort. It had built a record of justification for the tactic of resistance it was next to adopt: sabotage. End quote. The creation of underground grassroots cells, you see, was only half of the ANC's plan to deal with the increased government repression. The other half was the creation of a new military wing called, quote, Mkauto Onto Wisizwi, end quote. Zulu for, quote, Spear of the Nation, end quote, commonly abbreviated MK. The first leader of MK was Nelson Mandela himself. Not everyone in the ANC wanted an armed wing at first, but growing government violence galvanized them. According to Mandela, quote, all lawful modes of expressing opposition to bracket apartheid in bracket had been closed by legislation, and we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government. We chose to defy the law. We first broke the law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence. When this form was legislated against, and then the government resorted to a show of force to crush oppositions to its policies, only then did we decide to answer violence with violence, end quote. Many ANC executives were hesitant to cast off their peaceful reputation, but the rank and file were, quote, overwhelmingly in favor, end quote, of forceful resistance. This next paragraph has the I in a circle with the cross out like not this, and it says active counter intel. So the change was swift given the unfavorable conditions. Although strongly motivated, few ANC members were prepared for real war. The M plan was an excellent blueprint, but most people had not really believed that the government would actually ban the ANC. As a result, at the beginning of the 1960s, the ANC still lacked secure underground networks. Parentheses, not parentheses, so sorry. Parentheses, I'm so sorry. Let alone paramilitary networks, end parentheses. Few members had military experience or discipline, and military leaders and organizations had not yet been developed. The organization also had major logistical shortcomings. It lacked physical bases, stockpiles of weaponry, funds, and international support. They had virtually no counterintelligence capacity. Davis put it mildly, quote, conditions were extremely disadvantageous for campaigns of armed resistance in 1960s, end quote. Nevertheless, within 2 years of being banned, the ANC began military operations, starting with sabotage. Mandela and the others leading MK, quote, viewed sabotage as an introductory tactic in which what would have to become a full-scale guerrilla war if its objective of toppling apartheid was not achieved in the first wave of attacks. The new military leadership hoped that bombings of transport and communications networks would throw the economy into disarray and put foreign capital to flight, and that reeling from such blows, bracket the capital, Pretoria would come to its senses and join the ANC at the bargaining table, end quote. Next.
To recruit personnel, MK engaged the help of the Congress of Trade Unions, which had not been banned. These unions, writes Davis, quote, served as the Umkhonto fronts, channeling volunteers to convert political education classes, local sabotage training, or overseas guerrilla camps, end quote. And there's a little icon that says security culture. And it has a little finger up to a lips that says, shh. In his book, My Fight Against Apartheid, Michael Dingake describes the excitement and hazards of the time. Quote, the inauguration of MK brought a new spirit of daring do and readiness for extreme sacrifices. The successful sabotage operations of 1962 through 1963 created extreme overconfidence with its dangerous corollaries of recklessness and complacency. Regions, areas, streets, and cells, through their structure, exhorted the membership to observe some elementary rules of security. Change venues of meetings, be punctual at meetings, don't discuss your role in the organization with other members of the organization who are not working directly with you. Be careful whom you talk to and what you say, etc. End quote. But what actually happened? Quote, these elementary principles were broken daily. The non-observance of the rules could never be regarded as deliberate and conscious. It was all the result of emotional fervor, overwhelming common sense, and mutual trust generated among the membership by the wave of spectacular achievements of MK. The optimistic side of the mood was good. The incipient complacency and recklessness produced by such a mood, however, was dangerous, end quote. This lack of security culture would have dire consequences. In her book, The Struggle, A History of the African National Congress, Heidi Holland remarks on the challenges of implementing good security practices. Many in MK's junior ranking struggle groups had difficulty adapting to the code of secrecy. And not everyone in MK was living underground, she continues. Quote, the fact that the identities of Umkhonto's leaders were known only to the Central Command Corps meant that many organizers of the armed struggle continued to live openly in the community, their underground roles remaining undetected even by those who knew them well, end quote. Members who had been banned had more difficulty moving around. Mandela constantly changed his appearance and wore elaborate disguises. Despite the structure offered by the M Plan, MK was terribly unprepared to launch a guerrilla campaign in the early 1960s. Joe Slovo, one of MK's main strategists, explained, quote, among the lot of us, we did not have a single pistol. No one we knew had ever engaged in urban sabotage with homemade explosives. Some of us had been in the army, but for all practical purposes, our knowledge of the techniques required for this early stage of the struggle was extremely rudimentary, end quote. Even once the sabotage campaign was underway, the only gun MK possessed was an air rifle Mandela had used for target practice. Because of their lack of experience and knowledge, they had to engage in extensive, laborious, and dangerous experimentation. MK set up a bomb-making factory in the apartment of Jack Hodgson, a member with military experience. They brought in sacks of potassium permanganate, and ground the crystals into a fine powder by hand using mortars and pestles. In Hodgson's kitchen, they experimented with different timing devices and eventually settled on one made of thin tubing from a particular type of ballpoint pen. To improvise an incendiary device, they used a bottle of acid. Quote, its outlet covered by a specified thickness of cardboard, and the bottle having to be turned upside down immediately before it was placed in a targeted area, end quote. Though many houses were raided, Hodgson's apartment, where a fine dust of potassium permanganate covered every surface, was not. But their R&D process was full of dangers. After making their first Molotov cocktails, they went to test the incendiaries at an abandoned brickwork. They were confronted by the night watchman and were nearly compromised, but a persuasive Mandela convinced the guard to leave them be. Next.
Their techniques were not technically sophisticated. Davis notes that MK, quote, was on the whole a low-cost, appropriate technology sabotage campaign that required of its field sections little more than small arsenals of dynamite and gasoline for bomb making, wire cutters to slice telephone cables, and other easily obtainable tools. The next paragraph has a little binocular icon that says operational security. That doesn't mean their techniques were safe, and just reading the stories of their early experimentation and operations with explosive is enough to make one cringe. A former commander in DMK, Ronnie Casseroles, describes stealing half a ton of dynamite from a construction site one night by smashing open the storage magazine and then making a high-speed getaway on a bumpy gravel road. Quote, "We knew next to nothing about using dynamite, let alone storing it," end quote. Soon after, he writes, quote, "I was dispatched to the Durban Library to consult books on mining and explosives. To my horror, I read the safety regulations. Never drive in excess of 15 miles per hour when transporting dynamite was one rule. It is forbidden to strike a match or make sparks where dynamite is stored was another. Dynamite must be stored under cool, well-ventilated conditions was yet one more chilling rule. What alarmed me far more than the recollection of the violent way we had cracked open the magazines and our rapid getaway was the horrific thought of our explosives sweating miserably in the small, stuffy storeroom of a school," end quote. They quickly installed a fan and distributed the stolen dynamite to various caches on the outskirts of town. The headquarters of MK were located at Lily's Leaf Farm, a small farm in Rivonia, a Johannesburg suburb. In order to maintain their cover story and avoid suspicion from neighbors, the MK High Command actually ran a genuine farming operation. Little little guy with sunglasses icon that says low profile. They sold their produce at a roadside stand to customers, including oblivious police officers. The farm was purchased with funds from South Africa's Communist Party and with donations from other African states arranged by Mandela and others during their international fundraising tours. A second house was purchased in the same suburb to serve as an arms factory, a third as a hideout. The next paragraph is a little icon with little guys and says screening. In 1963, the security situation was precarious. The police were able to recruit large numbers of collaborators and even took out advertisements for informers in black newspapers. They could offer cash equal to 10 months of work in exchange for information. Some ANC prisoners who were given virtually no training on how to resist interrogation cracked under brutal police questioning that often included torture. MK headquarters in Rivonia received a great deal of traffic, and many movement participants, including those not part of the High Command, had visited the location. The command group was aware of this and was concerned about meeting there, but lacked alternative locations. They decided to have one final meeting on July 11th to discuss Operation Mayibuye, a proposed plan for a guerrilla uprising. That afternoon, the farm was raided by police. Virtually the entire leadership of MK was arrested. A previous ANC arrestee, who turned under questioning, had been able to lead the police to the site. MK's security problems had finally caught up to them. This became even more obvious during the trial. The prosecution's star witness was another informer, Bruno Mtolo, who had been among MK's most active saboteurs. In a pattern reminiscent of Brendan Darby, Mtolo testified enthusiastically. A former petty criminal and a disgruntled member of both the ANC and the Communist Party, Mtolo knew far more people than he should have under the 10-member rule. ANC members were horrified to see that Mtolo would, quote, go out of his way to implicate people who were not even suspected by the police, end quote, and volunteer huge amounts of information. He even fabricated information he hadn't witnessed in order to straighten the case of the state. In an autobiography published after the trial, Mtolo wrote that whites were in South Africa for some higher reason and suggested that the ANC draft new policies that were acceptable to the white government. During the trial, considerable information was presented by the prosecution on MK sabotage to date. Davis writes, quote, between June 1961 and July 1963, some 194 scattershot sabotage operations hit such targets as communications and transport facilities, fuel dumps, utilities, and government buildings, end quote. According to the government, a typical attack cost perhaps $10,000 of damage, adjusted for inflation, which with large attacks worth over $500,000. The MK commanders barely avoided the death sentence. Most received life in prison. And because of traitors like Mtolo, many more MK members were identified. Some escaped into exile. Others were captured. Many of those were tortured, and some died in custody. For the already underprepared organization, this was a terrible blow. Popular desire for a violent uprising turned to fear and disorganization. The following decade was one of quiet for MK, a time of consolidation. The organization didn't disappear, but conducted much of its training and operations in exile. Over a decade passed before Black South Africans would rise up in great numbers. This began in Soweto. In June of 1976, thousands of students marched in peaceful protest against the forced teaching of colonial languages. Police opened fire. A series of street conflicts followed in which youth, including children, skirmished with the police. Next.
So that is a good place for us to stop the reading section of this session. Let me take note that we were on page 347. 347. There we go. All right. So, even though sometimes we'll finish a section of reading and that we will have covered a ton of subjects, but this one we really didn't cover that many subjects. We mostly just covered like operational security, compartmentalization of information. So yeah, we spent kind of a little while like kind of meditating on this subject, and I wonder if people have thoughts that immediately come to mind on this section.
I guess for me, it's just, a fascinating topic, because how do you like maintain that security at all times? I mean, even this organization is talking about, they had a 10-member rule. Well, once like 20 people saw that guy, shouldn't somebody else in the organization have like raised a red flag that like, hey, like, like too many people know this guy, something like that. But it is always an interesting question. How do you maintain that? And is there ever like a way that will be like completely secure, completely 100%? I don't know. It never seems like it will be. But
Yeah. Oh no, please go ahead.
Oh no, I just think that it's just really good to kind of see the different techniques so you don't reinvent the wheel and start with the beginning part where you're like failing because you didn't keep it in cells. I thought that was a good point.
Yeah, it seems like, when it comes to the numerous people knowing the one guy, the same thing happened in Germany, right? This is pretty much like one of the most common failure points. And as in Germany, when they get caught, it always boils down to them having been sloppy on security, right? They had rules, they had all kinds of regulations in place, but it's not, if people don't follow that, then it's not enough. And unfortunately, that does always form a weak link. I think the challenge is a big challenge is this movement from being an above ground organization to being like a clandestine organization. That seems like a big challenge that the movement, against tyranny continually faces in these examples.
And that's why you need training and readings and prep work, and so much things go into making sure that it doesn't, just implode on its like first day, or explode, or just end.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that moving slow is clearly the best solution, where you only move at the speed where you feel like you've vetted people and they're educated and they're good, their operational security is locked down. It's just hard because sometimes circumstances dictate to you the speed you have to move. And then it's like, it's all about how do you cope with that fact? Like, what are best practices for um, moving fast when you wish you wish you had time to move slow.
Yeah. I think that it made a good point about calling each other out, because if you guys aren't calling each other out when you make like the small mistakes, then it just comes bigger and bigger, and people get more and more lax for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a big part of it is, once again, like in our example, especially here with the ANC, this transition from the above ground to the below ground, all of your sort of cultural touch points begin to change really fast. So, it would have been totally fine to be a little bit sloppy when you were above ground. But now those same behaviors, now that you're below ground, are extremely dangerous. They're like existential threats. And so that transition really seems to be one of the challenges. And I guess what that really means is that you have to start getting people trained up well before the circumstantial pressures come around.
Or maybe recruit people who have had training or know kind of like bare minimums. Like I think if you were ever to like have to hurry up and make a group, I'd want everybody to self-study, and then they can like you have to get to a certain point so that you're not like inside the group while you're still learning. Like you're outside until you can come in.
Yeah, that's actually what they do in that's what a specifismo does. A specifismo actually requires you to come around the organization for a year before they will even let you into the organization. And then in order to be admitted into the organization, they require you to have to go through like a course plan. Like you have to like read books and like write them an essay kind of shit before they'll let you in. Much stricter than Cooperation Tulsa. Anybody else have any thoughts either on that topic or other topics that we read about?
I thought it was an interesting kind of coincidence that they were saying that this guy is also one of the main saboteurs, drawing back to that other case we were reading about where, these guys are pushing violence or pushing the destruction. I mean, how does he get to stage a lot of these attacks and still get off scot-free? But, again, it's just like another kind of tell, I guess, of if they're so willing to do violence, like what does that say?
That is like absolutely one of the best tells. One of the best tells is the person most willing to do violence is very likely the person that you should definitely be side-eyeing that person. You know, that person is definitely, it's not that they're the weakest link, you know, it's possible that person will be useful when the time comes, but they are also very likely, that's something that infiltrators would do, right? That is something that infiltrators generally would do, is they would try to push you towards violence. But also, I think there's an element to it where, you know, if you've engaged in a lot of the violence and if you're one of the main saboteurs, well, then you're probably also kind of nervous that you're going to be the one on the cutting block, you know, or on the chopping block. You're the one that's carried out like so much of the illegal stuff. You're terrified that you're going to be focused on. And so I think you might even be more likely to flip. Although in the example here of the ANC, this guy sounded like weirdly ideologically aligned with the enemy. You know, talking about the white man has come to Africa with a special purpose. Like, that's wild. That's crazy. He's more even than saving his own skin. He's like ideologically aligned with his enemy.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, how much he was like, you know, like watching them radicalize and was like, oh, sure, I'll go along with this for a while, but I'm going to gather up as much information as I can. And then also like spur them along to do more, you know, more things. I don't know. It's very like, it's like a self-fulfilling like ideology of like, look at how these leftists are doing violence. And it's like, well, you were the main one. Like, I don't know. It's just so wild.
No, for sure.
A wild coincidence, really.
Well, I don't know about a coincidence. It's definitely something that law enforcement does a lot. Entrapment. There's so many cases of that arrests were made that would have never had been necessary to make if the police hadn't like orchestrated the whole thing from the beginning.
Yes, true. Very true.
There's also in Canada there was a neo-Nazi like organization party called the Heritage Front in the 80s and 90s, and one of the founders was a member of the an employee of an agent with CSIS, which is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And like, if they hadn't paid him to found it, it wouldn't have existed. You know, like, yeah.
Any other thoughts? I thought it was kind of interesting. One thing that occurs to me when I'm like reading through this is like, they had to create a cell structure where, you know, only 5 or 10 people knew somebody else in the structure. That seems like a big challenge when you're going from a situation where everybody in the organization already knows each other. So like, by default, you already know everybody else in the organization. So like, how do you do the transition into the process where you don't know anybody more than 5 people? Maybe the idea is like, you establish like, you know, you don't know who's involved in the guerrilla structure. Like, you all know each other from the bigger organization, but you don't know who else is or is not involved in another cell that's been established alongside it. Maybe that's kind of the ideal, where you start forming groups of 5, but that group of 5 only knows the 5 of those people are actually in a cell. They don't know anybody else is in a cell. Maybe that's the solution.
Yeah, for sure. And they don't know their roles, and they don't communicate, like, except maybe if there is the need for like an actual like those diagrams, those like drawings that we saw earlier with the networks. It's like there's only the dedicated people who are like maybe a link between the cells if it's like absolutely necessary, but otherwise you don't discuss what's happening in the cell and you don't talk to other people about that. So it's like you know each other, but you won't talk about the work, the underground work with them or something.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's probably more like a wink and a nod that, like, hey, yeah, we kind of assume we're all working together towards this, but we're, if you're doing the operational security correctly, you're just not discussing things outside of yourself. But it's like if you have that one leader who's talking to one other person from another cell, I think that's where it gets like exponential, like really quickly, because you could easily build larger cell networks quickly just based on that. But
Somebody in chat asked, are cells divided into specialized tasks, or does it make sense to balance the workloads for flexibility? It's interesting because he showed us both in this book so far. So previously he talked about how the cells would be separated up into functions. Like every cell would have some basic functions covered, but some were covering like specific tasks. Whereas this last one, it seems like every cell was kind of self-sufficient in a sense. But it seems like their solution when you compartmentalize the tasks is that you have like a single person that is the connector with the other functions. Like if you compartmentalize it, you have one person that's in one of the cells that is in communication with one of the functions, and some person is in connection with a cell that's one of the other functions. I think that seems to be what he's presenting as the solution, where you only have like one point of contact in each group for each other functionality, if that's the way you're going to do it. And then those specific people they have to have impeccable operational security, because they're the people that if they fuck it up, then they really screw it up for everybody.
And in this case, I mean, they are part of a huge organization, so they might want to have, well, it sounds like they did, but it's unclear how much they meant to have contact between the different cells or different people or whatever, and as part of like making the organization work, or versus like that didn't respect the security culture, which is like I think I'm remembering the first time we read it, but like it sounds like oftentimes that's how movements or like organization get arrested or collapse. It's oftentimes because people don't respect the security culture for whatever reason, right? So that's definitely a lesson to definitely learn. But I was thinking also that it's very, but that this model, it was said that it was based a lot on like geography. It made me think of this episode of Cool People Who Do Cool Things about Minnesota that I was listening to, and how they were talking. It was mostly about like how, yeah, like a lot of people have, I guess maybe this notion that such huge resistance, like so many people are involved in resisting the attacks by ICE, that it must be coordinated in some way. But then like you get there and then you're asked like, who's the guy to talk to? But then that people are very much organizing within like a few blocks radius, and you don't really know what's happening above that. They're just protecting their neighbors where they are, and it's also making it so it makes it a much more manageable challenge to organize like that. And also if few people get arrested, hopefully other people can continue the resistance.
Yeah, I think compartmentalizing by neighborhood is a good way to go. You know, compartmentalizing by neighborhood or by apartment building or whatever it ends up being. I think that's a really good way to go. In like, that's that's the a cell is situated at that range, scale. You know. Still got 10 minutes left. Anybody have any kind of last thoughts for us to talk about here in the last few minutes?
Do you happen to know what it kind of meant when it said around the world and also in South Africa? Like, like South Africa is not around the world.
I don't know. Maybe he was just emphasizing it.
I kind of thought that, but if he wouldn't have said and, and like he didn't say especially or anything like that, or
Right. Yeah.
it was just
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. Or including South Africa. Yeah. Yeah. And South Africa, which, is not around the world. Yeah. 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 No, this section's super important. I think that this is sort of like some of the nitty gritty stuff that really is not super fun to learn about, but it's just integrally important. And all these examples he's given, this has been one of the failure points of these movements. It's you have to manage it appropriately, and if people don't practice like smart operational security, it can just destroy everything. Our enemies really rely on us being sloppy,
I forgot where I heard this, but definitely I think was it part of this huge trial, I don't know how to say this, case in the UK right now to try to figure out what happened and hold accountable a bunch of like police aid. I forget if they were agents that infiltrated or informants, maybe both, in wow, in whatever, I can't remember, some movements in the UK, and then entered in like decades long relationship with women that turned out were like completely, like, they didn't know who those guys were. They didn't know they were informants until after. And I think it was part of that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I think one of the police that were saying that it was really hard to infiltrate leftists compared to right-wing movements, I guess, because a lot of them, like, you had often time to know theory a lot, like anarchist theory or something like that. So you had to study a lot, and then you had to like sound pretty like well prepared. So I guess like a way to do that is to have some well, I guess it doesn't help. Well, never mind. Anyway, whatever. Sorry about that.
Wait, what were you saying there at the end?
Well, I thought I was gonna make a point, but then my point didn't make sense, so I stopped. I'm so glad we're live.
Hell yeah, that's what's up.
I think you're just trying to say that, like, yeah, it's like it's harder, or they perceive it as being harder to infiltrate because of, you're dealing with maybe someone who's not trying to, like, they're trying to go after criminals. They're not trying to like get educated on, all these obscure topics, right? So then they burn out on it and they don't want to do it because that's not, again, they're not smart enough to like really get behind that idea, or it might even radicalize them. Who knows?
Yeah. I think that is, I mean, it's absolutely true. Yeah. There's like files that were released, internal police files that showed that they had difficulty infiltrating anarchist groups. And part of it was that anarchist funding was really hard to pin down. It didn't come from one source. So they couldn't just eliminate that one source. Instead, it came from like a bunch of sources that all trickled small pieces in, and that was just like basically infeasible for them to sabotage, and that they had to learn way too much theory. Otherwise, they would just sound out of place, and that was also very prohibitive for them, and that anarchists had good operational security and operated in affinity groups and all of that, which compartmentalized information and made it to where it was hard for them to figure out what was actually being done and what was being planned and so on. So yeah, the methods work, absolutely. And apparently it's frustrating to them, which delightful. Love it. Yeah, we got 3 minutes left. I just want to tell everybody who is watching, I appreciate everybody tuning in to the live streams. These live streams don't get as much viewership as the Anark channel live streams, but that's totally fine. I just want to remind everybody that if you want to help support Cooperation Tulsa, you should go over to our Open Collective and become a donor for any amount. I'm going to put that link in the chat. Give me just a moment. And if you become a donor for any amount and you would like to become part of our reading group, if you'd like to join this reading group, then all you have to do is just reach out to us, tell us that you become a donor, and we will give you a link to our Discord server, to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server. So not only will that allow you to know when organizer education is taking place, it's also going to allow you to know when popular education is taking place. It'll also just kind of let you keep up to date with like Cooperation Tulsa's events in general, and you'll be able to see us giving updates on the progress of Flat Rock and stuff like that. So if that sounds enticing to you, you should go over to our Open Collective and become a recurring donor for any amount. That is, I should add, how the organization makes almost all its income. We've written a few grants over the course of the organization's history, but the vast majority of our money comes from people like you donating small amounts. So I appreciate everybody who becomes a recurring donor. It's, helping keep Cooperation Tulsa afloat. And because there's so many of you donating small amounts, just like we were talking about a minute ago with the police not being able to sabotage funding sources because they come from so many places, that keeps us resilient in that exact way. It's really hard for them to sabotage, hundreds of people giving small amounts. So, it's important, and we appreciate everybody who's watching. We appreciate everybody who becomes a donor. Sheep with Shotgun asked a question here at the very end. Unfortunately, I don't know if we'll have time to weigh in. We only have 1 minute. But they were saying, you guys have any thoughts on Chairman Paul Birdsong and the Black Lion Party? Do you see a connection there in the subject matter discussed today? I don't know enough about it. I've seen people saying all kinds of things about it. I've seen people calling them out. I've seen people saying that it's a good thing. So I don't personally have an opinion on it, but I will definitely look more into it in the future. I think this is a good place for us to call the session to a close. I appreciate you showing up to readers. I appreciate you showing up here in the Jitsi. And I appreciate, oh my God, wow, you gave a heart and it did the whole noise. That was phenomenal. I appreciate everybody showing up in the Jitsi chat. I appreciate everybody showing up in the stream chat. And come back again next Monday. It will be popular education again. And if you'd like to come back for organizer education, it will be Monday after next. Any occasion, appreciate y'all showing up. Have a good evening.
Take care, all. Bye.
Bye.